Welcome to the shadowed past. Step into the hidden corners of history where mysteries, scandals, and forbidden tales come to life. In the comments below, tell us which city you are watching from and what time it is where you are right now. Let's discover where viewers from all over the world are tuning in as we explore the darkest corners of history. The first time she reached the edge of the jungle, few paid her any attention. A young girl, no older than 16, with skin that gleamed under the afternoon sun, walked lightly along the cracked dirt path that led from the river to the remote plantation. Her eyes were wide, alert and quiet, carrying secrets that no one could guess. Her hands, though small, moved with precision born of necessity, brushing aside leaves and adjusting the worn straps of her simple clothes. She spoke very little, not because she could not, but because she had learned early that careless words could be dangerous. The plantation master, a man of average height, with a thick beard and a habit of barking orders, hardly glanced at her as she was led forward. He had seen hundreds of girls like her, taken from distant homes and forced to work under the relentless heat of the southern sun. To him, she was just another addition to his workforce, another pair of hands to bend to his will. But when his gaze fell on her, something about her unsettled him. It was not boldness, it was the opposite. She did not flinch at his stare, nor did she lower her eyes. Instead, there was a steady, calm intelligence there, something that made him feel uneasy, though he could not explain why. The overseer, a wiry man with restless eyes and a cruel temper, stepped forward to lead her to the quarters where the other slaves lived. He muttered instructions about her duties, fetching water, tending the garden, helping in the kitchen, but she barely listened. Her attention was elsewhere, drawn to the thick forest that bordered the plantation. The jungle began where the cultivated fields ended, an unbroken wall of green that seemed alive, whispering in the wind. Most of the white men avoided it. They told stories about wild beasts, poisonous plants, and strange noises that traveled through the canopy at night. But the girl did not hesitate. She watched, studied, and memorized every edge, every shadow, every sound. The first days were the hardest. She worked silently, performing the tasks assigned to her, keeping her head low, moving swiftly when no one was looking. But the jungle called to her. At night, when the overseer's lanterns dimmed and the other slaves slept in their rows of wooden bunks, she crept to the edge of the clearing, crouching behind ferns, watching the trees sway in the moonlight. She listened to the rhythm of the wind, the rustle of leaves, and the distant roars of animals. Every sound was a puzzle, each movement a clue. She learned to tell the cry of a hawk from the whisper of a human, the snap of a twig from the shift of a predator. No one suspected her talents at first. She seemed fragile, almost ordinary, carrying water buckets and tending the garden with quiet skill. Yet her eyes held a spark of understanding that made her different from everyone else. She did not fear the jungle because she did not see it as a threat. She saw it as home, a living, breathing entity to be studied, respected, and understood. Her mind mapped every hidden path, every hollow, every vine that could hold her weight. She began testing herself against it, venturing further each night, learning to move silently, to use shadows for cover, and to anticipate the movements of the creatures that lived there. Her first real test came when a small group of white men decided to assert their control. They had noticed her near the jungle's edge after work and took it as a challenge. One of them, a brash young man with a cruel smirk, insisted he could follow her and teach her obedience. He had no idea she had been watching him just as closely. She had memorized every patrol route, every hidden gap, every moment they lowered their guard. She waited, patient, letting the jungle itself assist her. He followed her one evening, insisting she lead him to her secret places to prove she was hiding nothing. She walked slowly, deliberately, letting him think he was ahead, guiding him along paths that seemed safe and simple. But the further he went, the more lost he became. The sounds of the forest grew louder, the chatter of insects, the distant calls of birds, the rustle of unseen animals. Shadows shifted strangely, vines twisted oddly. Every step led him deeper into the wild he could not understand. Meanwhile, the girl moved with exact precision, observing him from just beyond his sight. She noted his breathing, his posture, the way he hesitated at strange sounds. She had learned from the jungle how to manipulate perception, using the natural chaos of the forest to her advantage. By the time he realized he was lost, night had fallen fully. The jungle buzzed with life, its sounds closing in, yet she was invisible in the thick foliage. He stumbled, terrified, trying to retrace his steps, but found nothing familiar. She watched silently from above, crouched on a low branch. His panic was nearly visible, and she understood the lesson had begun. She did not need to strike or shout. The jungle, trained by her presence and knowledge, did the work. Twigs snapped under unseen weight. Shadows moved just out of reach. Predators' calls echoed in the distance. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but the paths twisted back to the same clearing he could not recognize. By his final desperate attempt, she had vanished entirely. No one ever saw him again. Whispers spread across the plantation about his disappearance, growing with each retelling. Some said the girl commanded the animals, controlling the forest itself. Others claimed the jungle was alive, and she was its chosen guide. Fear of her grew quickly, but no one dared speak openly, afraid of the strange, uncanny power she seemed to hold. Despite the legend, the girl remained calm and deliberate. She never flaunted her skills, never laughed at those who failed. She moved between the plantation and jungle, gathering food, observing the land, and learning. Each day she grew more attuned to the forest, more capable of moving unseen, more confident that patience and strategy could triumph over brute force. Other slaves noticed her presence, though few approached. They saw how the white men whispered about her, how fear affected their posture and tone. Slowly she became a figure of quiet power, someone who had mastered the impossible, someone who had turned the tables on those who had always thought themselves untouchable. By the end of her first month, the plantation had shifted subtly. Men moved cautiously, glances sharpened, and the air carried an attention that had not existed before. Yet she remained invisible when she chose, moving with a grace that belied her youth, experience, and the extraordinary skills she had begun to master. No one knew her name at first. She was simply the girl of the jungle, the shadow that moved without sound, the spirit of the trees. As the first part of her story closed, it was clear this was only the beginning. The forest had chosen her, and anyone who followed would enter a realm from which they could never return. From the first day she stepped beyond the plantation fences, she felt the jungle's heartbeat, its subtle rhythm pulsing through roots, vines, and leaves. It whispered to her in a language older than memory, guiding her steps, teaching patience, showing where to tread lightly and where to move boldly. Over the following weeks she learned more than she had imagined possible. She distinguished predators from scavengers, the sound of a startled bird from an approachee. Every creature became part of her lessons, each moment a step in survival, perception, and strategy. By daylight she returned to the plantation, carrying water or tending the garden as if nothing remarkable had occurred. The white men were unsettled by her quiet composure, how she seemed invisible yet appeared in exactly the right place. They saw only a simple girl, incapable of danger. Only the jungle knew the truth, and it was teaching her to channel that knowledge into power. She ventured deeper during times when the overseers were distracted. The thick trees blocked sunlight, yet she never stumbled. She learned to read the faintest signs, broken twigs, crushed leaves, subtle shifts of shadows. The jungle became her teacher, protector, and playground. She discovered hidden streams under dense foliage, pockets of edible plants unknown to the plantation, and secret hollows where the moss-covered ground cushioned her steps perfectly. Every night she traced the land in her mind, memorizing routes, hidden trails, and secret dangers that only she could move through safely. It was during one of these nocturnal wanderings that she stumbled upon caves nestled in the side of a rocky slope that few dared to approach. Their entrances were shadowed and ominous, partly hidden by hanging vines and thick ferns. Most white men avoided the place entirely, whispering stories of snakes, bats, and restless spirits dwelling within. She felt nothing but curiosity. To her, the cave was a refuge, a quiet place to rest, to plan, and to study without being disturbed. She explored its interior carefully, taking note of every twist, every hidden pool of water, and every small crevice that could serve as a hiding place or a trap for anyone foolish enough to follow. From the cave, she began experimenting with the creatures around her. She watched them closely, noticing how they reacted to sound, movement, and scent. Birds, monkeys, and smaller mammals each had patterns, and she learned to imitate or manipulate them when needed. By rustling leaves here, or snapping a twig there, she could draw an observer's attention away from her own hidden path. She figured out which animals could be friends and which were threats, and adjusted her movements accordingly. The more she learned, the bolder she became. Her first real test involved a white overseer, a man particularly cruel who constantly watched her, searching for an excuse to punish her. One evening she allowed him to follow, thinking he would catch her wandering the jungle. Instead, she guided him along a twisting path she had committed to memory, through fallen trees, thick vines, shallow streams, and dense brush. Every step she took was deliberate, every decision meant to confuse and frighten him. The overseer stumbled repeatedly, muttering curses under his breath, trying desperately to find his way. Every trail he took seemed to loop back upon itself. Each direction he chose turned into a circle. Panic crept into his voice, trembling in a way that revealed him to the forest itself. The animals, sensing the disturbance, joined in. A sudden rustle of leaves, the scream of a hawk, the distant call of a predator, all seemed to close in around him. He was trapped, ensnared by the jungle, while she observed silently, hidden. Nature itself had become her ally. By the time he finally scrambled back toward the plantation, he was exhausted, terrified, muttering incoherently about the girl in the jungle who seemed alive. Word of his ordeal spread quickly, though some dismissed it as exaggeration. Still, unease began to grow. Plantation men whispered in corners, their eyes flicking nervously toward the edge of the forest. Even the master noticed something different about her, sensing a quiet, dangerous strength beneath her youth and seeming fragility. In the following days, she ventured further. She discovered hidden trails that led to small clearings with soft, fertile soil, perfect for gathering roe, teas, and herbs. She learned which plants could heal and which could harm. She built subtle traps, not deadly, but enough to confuse anyone following her. Tripwires made of vines, small pits disguised with leaves, and carefully placed markers misled pursuers' eyes. Each night she returned to the plantation with what she needed, blending in seamlessly with the others. No one guessed the depth of her knowledge, the precision of her steps, or the power she quietly wielded. She also learned patience. The jungle taught her that time could be a tool. Actions that seemed slow or careful often achieved far more than those done in haste. She watched, waited, and prepared, understanding that her survival depended not on strength alone but on cleverness and foresight. She became a master at anticipating the moves of men and animals alike. Her connection to the jungle grew stronger. She noticed the wind patterns, the way water flowed, the subtle shifts of shadows, things others never saw. She could sense rainfall from the smell of the earth, detect predators before they appeared, and spot human intrusions long before anyone else noticed. The forest became part of her, a living network she could navigate unseen and untouchable. One evening, as the sun sank beneath the horizon, she met another intruder, a man sent to track her, confident he could capture or punish her. Her nights became a mix of exploration and preparation. She mapped the jungle more thoroughly, marking dangerous zones and safe routes, learning where predators roamed and where clean water flowed. She left subtle signals for herself, marks on trees, disturbances in the undergrowth, that let her travel great distances without fear of being lost. Each day she became more attuned to the land, able to use its rhythms to her advantage. As the moon rose high over the plantation, spilling silver light across the dense canopy, she moved silently through the forest. Every leaf, every branch, every creature seemed to respond to her presence. She was no longer just a girl sent to labor on a plantation. She was the guardian of her domain, a master of the jungle, a figure whose skill and knowledge ensured that no white man could follow her path and return. By the time she returned to the plantation's edge with food and water, she was already planning the next move. The jungle had become her teacher, her shield, her ally. She knew with certainty that anyone foolish enough to follow would vanish like those who had already disappeared, lost to the forest and its secrets, never to return. Night settled over the plantation, quiet except for distant animal cries. She crouched at the edge of the fields for a moment, watching guards and the master's men move through their routines, unaware of her mastery. Then she slipped silently into the shadows, vanishing once more into the heart of the jungle. The legend of the girl began to grow, an unstoppable force of nature, a master of the land, a mystery that would haunt anyone who dared pursue her. The first man to vanish had been arrogant, dismissive, certain the jungle held no secrets he could not uncover. He was the overseer's favorite, a young white man with a sharp tongue and a cruel streak, months spent terrorizing the slaves. When he decided to follow her, he imagined a simple demonstration of authority, a lesson in obedience. He could not have been more wrong. It began innocently. She had emerged from the fields at dusk, carrying herbs and roots gathered earlier. The man saw her immediately, eyes narrowing in recognition, confident she would not act out. But she had learned patience, observation, and the art of letting her prey feel in control. He followed quietly, confident in his tracking skills, thinking he knew the land. But she moved differently. Each step was precise, careful, leaving no trace, no scent, no sound. She moved with the rhythm of the jungle itself. Hours passed, and his confidence faltered. Every clearing, every path seemed to shift beneath him. Shadows stretched and shrank impossibly, sounds bounced, leaving him unsure. Birds called from directions that made no sense. Leaves rustled where nothing moved. He began to sweat, cursing under his breath, refusing to admit he was lost. She watched from high in a hidden tree, noting every breath, every hesitation, the trembling of his hands. She had learned long ago that fear could be amplified without a word, without touch. Nature itself would obey her, and she understood it fully. Every creature, every shadow, every sound was part of the network she controlled. Night deepened, and the man grew desperate. The forest seemed to close around him. Paths he thought he knew circled back on themselves. Streams led to dead ends. Every crack of a twig and rustle of a branch felt magnified, threatening. He shouted for her, demanding answers. His voice echoed unnaturally, drawing attention from unseen animals. She allowed him panic, stepping silently between shadows. He stumbled into a trap she had set weeks before, a shallow pit covered with leaves and twigs, enough to confuse and delay him. Scrambling out, he became further entangled in the maze she knew intimately. The twisted roots, the low branches, the narrow paths that seemed to change depending on where he looked. Every move only brought him deeper into confusion. Further into the forest's deep embrace, hours slipped by, and the man's unease grew into genuine fear of the supernatural. He muttered about spirits, about the forest itself coming alive, about a girl who seemed not entirely human. Rumors spread quietly among the other plantation men, though very few dared to speak them aloud. But for the girl there was no magic at work. It was knowledge, it was patience, careful observation, and deep respect for her surroundings that allowed her to subtly guide him, influencing his movements without ever touching him. At the same time, she moved back into the familiar parts of the forest. He passed through secret hollows and overgrown trails that only she knew, slipping past both large predators and small, cautious creatures. Every sense of hers was sharpened, her mind alert to the smallest detail, the damp scent of earth, the soft shift of insects beneath leaves, the whisper of wind through the canopy. She was alive in a way that few could understand, intertwined with the jungle's complex web, a master of its rhythm and hidden secrets. By midnight, the overseer was completely exhausted. His shouts grew feeble, his steps slowed, and fear clouded his mind. He had no understanding of the forest, and he had no understanding of her. In that final moment, he stumbled into a narrow canyon, concealed beneath thick vines and moss. The girl watched silently from a nearby ridge as he vanished from sight. His cries gradually disappeared into the night, swallowed by the chorus of the jungle, leaving behind only echoes of his terror. When he did not return the following day, unease rippled through the plantation. The other men searched frantically, combing the jungle with torches and dogs, but they found nothing. Every trail seemed to shift just as they approached. The forest refused to reveal its secrets, and the girl remained the unseen hand guiding their failure. Quiet stories began to circulate among both the slaves and the plantation men, of a girl who could disappear into the forest, of twisting paths that led nowhere, of a forest that seemed to protect her as if it were alive. Fear spread, tangible and thick, lingering over every corner of the plantation. Despite the growing legend, she kept her routine. She carried water, tended the garden, and spoke only when necessary. Yet her mind never rested. It was always observing, always calculating. She learned from each encounter, every unsuccessful pursuit. She studied the men's reactions, their predictable movements, and the ways the forest could amplify their mistakes. Each failure of the white men's strength. Ned her understanding, her confidence, and the whispers of her legend. The slaves began noticing small changes. The once feared overseers now moved more carefully, hesitated where they had once commanded, and spoke in quiet tones about the girl and the jungle that seemed to shift around her. She never issued orders, yet her mere presence altered the balance of power. She understood that fear could be as potent a weapon as any whip or tool. The plantation became a stage for her influence, quietly felt but rarely named. Night after night she ventured further. She discovered hidden springs, pockets of medicinal herbs, and high vantage points from which she could survey broad stretches of the forest. She became familiar with the habits of every creature, the way hawks adjusted to the wind, the path of snakes beneath the leaves, the nightly routines of predators both large and small. Every piece of knowledge became a tool, every observation a potential advantage. She also learned to manipulate the human element. Sound and shadow became her allies, alongside the forest's natural obstacles. Twigs snapped just so, leaves rustled in strange patterns, animals reacted to her subtle signals. Her experience with the overseer had been her first lesson in this art, showing what patience and intelligence combined with knowledge of the natural world could achieve. Weeks turned into months, and the stories about her grew. Tales of her vanishing, her control over the forest, and the disappearance of those foolish enough to follow her spread throughout the plantation and nearby farms. No white man ventured into the jungle without hesitation, and even those who claimed courage often reconsidered, sometimes turning back entirely. She had become an invisible force, her influence reaching far beyond her immediate actions. One evening, a new man arrived, a wealthy landowner from a neighboring estate, confident and eager to prove the jungle held no secrets for him. He carried a lantern, a pistol, and an arrogant sense of certainty, believing that his wealth and knowledge would keep him safe. But he was already stepping into the trap the girl had anticipated. She had studied men like him, their impatience, overconfidence, and reliance on brute force rather than careful observation, and she had prepared. As he ventured into the forest, she allowed him to follow her path while remaining silent and unseen in the canopy. Every decision he made, every step he took, led him deeper into unfamiliar territory. Twigs snapped under unseen weight, leaves rustled in confusing patterns, and shadows seemed to twist unnaturally. Panic overtook him quickly as he realized the land was no longer under his control. By the time he vanished completely, she was already miles away, moving silently along her hidden trails, untouched and free. The jungle claimed him just as it had claimed the overseer before him. The legend of the girl, the black slave who thrived in the jungle, grew stronger. Her presence, skill, and connection to the forest became the subject of whispered conversations, fearful glances, and quiet warnings. No one could challenge her, no one could follow her, and the forest itself seemed to yield to her will. She returned to the plantation only when she chose, carrying water, herbs, and knowledge from her explorations. She moved among the fields and the men as if nothing had happened, yet the awareness of her power lingered in every hushed word, every wary glance. The forest had taught her patience, observation, strategy, and cunning. Now, her lessons extended beyond survival. They became legend. By the end of this chapter, it was clear she was no ordinary slave or child. She had become a master of the land, a silent orchestrator of fear, a presence so elusive and capable that the plantation itself seemed changed. The white men knew anyone who dared follow her would vanish, and the slaves recognized her as a protector, a guide, and a force beyond understanding. Her mastery of the jungle was defining her identity, and the tale of her first vanished pursuer would echo through generations as both a warning and a tribute to her skill. By the 4th week of her independence in the jungle, the girl had become something more than human in the eyes of the plantation. She was spoken of in whispers, a shadow among trees, a phantom of the forest, a force no white man could comprehend. But she did not concern herself with their fear. The jungle had taught her that true power came not from confrontation, but from patience, understanding, and strategy. Every branch, every leaf, every creature was now an extension of her will. She began to explore deeper territories, places the plantation men had never dared enter. The forest thickened, dense with vines and tangled undergrowth. Sunlight struggled to reach the floor, leaving it in a twilight of shifting shadows. It was a dangerous place, home to predators large and small, hidden pits, venomous plants, and unstable ground. Yet she moved through it with ease, barefoot and silent, attuned to every subtle detail, the faint scent of moss, the vibration of water under roots, the soft rustle of leaves hinting at unseen movement. The first time she tested a trap on purpose, it was almost accidental. A young plantation boy sent to fetch water wandered too close to a camouflaged pit she had prepared weeks earlier for practice. She watched quietly as he stumbled in. The pit was shallow, enough to frighten him and teach caution but not to harm. Her goal was understanding, to see how the land could protect her and warn others without direct confrontation. The boy scrambled out, crying and shaken, and ran back to the plantation. That night, adults whispered among themselves, claiming the jungle itself had trapped him with its spirits, though none dared investigate. Encouraged, she began crafting more sophisticated traps using vines, branches, and natural debris, designing snares, pitfalls, and misleading trails. Each one was subtle, almost invisible to untrained eyes. She experimented with camouflage, learning how sunlight, shadows, and movement could conceal her creations entirely. Each trap was tested carefully, refined repeatedly, until she had a network capable of confusing even the most determined pursuer. The forest became her ally. Birds flew overhead to distract, monkeys leapt through the canopy to mislead, small mammals crossed the forest floor in patterns that seemed random but were carefully orchestrated. Even the wind itself carried sounds and scents that worked in her favor, masking her presence and heightening the confusion for anyone who dared follow. Her growing skill did not go unnoticed. One evening, she spotted a group of white men approaching the forest's edge. There were at least 6, armed with lanterns, whips, and crude weapons, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and fear. They had come to challenge her, to prove once and for all that no girl, no matter how clever, could ever escape the reach of men. But she welcomed them, not with confrontation or anger, but with careful strategy. She had studied men like them, their habits, their overconfidence, their impatience, and the way they underestimated anything they could not immediately understand. She watched them as they entered the jungle, carefully noting their formation, their speed, and the way they moved across the uneven terrain. She let them take the lead, believing themselves in control, confident in their authority, but every step they took was quietly guided, subtly manipulated, and closely observed. She had already set up multiple false paths, hidden pitfalls, and natural obstacles along the routes they were most likely to take. The forest itself seemed to shift beneath their feet. Shadows stretched longer, roots tangled around their steps, and leaves whispered misleading directions that tricked the ear. It did not take long for confusion to set in. One man tripped over a hidden vine, falling into a shallow ditch and scraping himself painfully. Another stumbled into a pit cleverly disguised with leaves, catching a branch painfully as he fell. Panic spread among them, growing with the eerie sounds of the jungle. The distant screech of predators, the rustle of unseen creatures, the strange calls of birds that echoed unnaturally. Each man began to doubt his own senses, unsure what was real and what was illusion. From a high perch in the canopy, she observed quietly. She had learned long ago that fear could be more effective than violence, that confusion could be used as a weapon without ever raising a hand. The men moved now with hesitation, their formation broken, their confidence gone. The forest seemed alive, acting with her against them. She let them struggle for a few minutes, then nudged a branch here, made a subtle animal sound there, guiding them deeper into the maze she had created. As night fell, the group became even more disoriented. Paths that looked clear looped back on themselves. Streams they tried to follow led only to dead ends. Natural dangers multiplied. Uneven ground, thorny vines, hidden roots, all combined to exhaust both body and mind. Their lanterns flickered, throwing shadows that distorted reality and deepened their fear. Every moment spent in the forest reinforced the lessons she herself had learned: control perception, respect the land, and let the environment do the work. One by one, the men began to falter. The strongest among them, a burly man with a cruel glare, tried to assert dominance, yelling at the others, attempting to reorganize them. But the forest responded differently to him, sending obstacles in his path at the moments he least expected. His frustration became a liability, creating mistakes that made their situation worse. By the time they realized they were truly lost, the girl was already miles away, moving silently along hidden paths, observing the results of her careful preparations. With satisfaction. Hours later, when the men finally staggered back to the edge of the plantation, if they returned at all, they were exhausted, frightened, and humiliated. They spoke of a girl who vanished into the forest, of traps that seemed impossible, of a jungle that appeared to move on its own against them. Their master, hearing their accounts, could only shake his head uneasily. No man had ever returned unscathed when she was involved, and that fact gnawed at him like a persistent shadow. But the girl did not gloat. She returned to her routines, fetching water, tending the garden, speaking little, moving quietly. Her mastery of the forest was not for show. It was for survival, for understanding, for protection. She knew that overconfidence was dangerous, that careful attention could mean the difference between life and death. The forest had taught her to respect its rhythms, and through that respect, she had gained an unmatched advantage over those who underestimated her. Other slaves began to notice the changes. The plantation no longer moved with the same certainty. Overseers hesitated, patrols slowed. Fear quietly seeped into every interaction. Some whispered about her in awe, wondering how such a young girl could command respect and influence without authority, weapons, or violence. She had become a living legend, a symbol of intelligence, courage, and the raw power of understanding nature. Night after night, she explored further, mapping territories untouched by humans. She discovered natural shelters, hidden springs, and pathways connecting distant clearings. She catalogued animal behavior, learning the timing of nocturnal hunters and the patterns of prey. Each piece of knowledge added another layer of control, another way to manipulate the environment to her advantage. Her traps became more elaborate. Simple pitfalls turned into complex mazes of vines and branches. False trails misled even the most determined pursuers. She learned to use sound and movement to create illusions. Branches snapping at precise moments, leaves rustling in deliberate patterns, animals subtly redirected to create distractions. Each innovation made the forest more mysterious, more formidable, more impossible to conquer. The plantation itself became a stage for her legend. White men moved cautiously, their confidence steadily eroded by repeated failures. Stories of her cleverness spread, whispered warnings and fearful glances growing with each encounter. Slaves recognized her as a protector, someone whose presence allowed them to navigate the dangers of the plantation with more certainty. She did not lead them directly, she did not give instructions. Her influence was felt in subtle changes, quiet respect, cautious behavior, silent acknowledgement of her skill. By this point, she was no longer simply a girl wandering the jungle. She had become a master of perception and strategy, a figure whose presence reshaped those around her. The forest was no longer just a backdrop. It was her ally, her teacher, and her weapon. Anyone daring to enter it, out of curiosity, arrogance, or malice, would find themselves ensnared in the web she had woven, guided by the rhythms of the jungle and the intelligence of the girl who moved with it rather than against it. Her legend continued to grow, whispered across fields, quarters, and nearby plantations. Fear, respect, and awe were now inseparable in every tale told of her. She remained quiet, deliberate, patient, always alert, always ready, a living embodiment of the jungle's power and mystery. The forest had claimed her, and she had claimed it in return. The balance of power had shifted, and there was no turning back. By the 5th week of her life in the jungle, she had become something beyond human. Her connection to the forest was no longer mere survival, it had become mastery. She knew the terrain intimately, every hidden path, every treacherous route, every pocket of fertile soil and fresh water. She could anticipate the movements of animals and humans alike, predicting behavior with uncanny accuracy. Plantation men spoke of her in hushed tones, half in awe, half in terror, while the slaves began to see her as more than a fellow captive. She had become a protector, a force of nature who had turned the world around them into her domain. One misty morning she sensed a new arrival, a group of armed men, more experienced and determined than any before. Their presence was deliberate and methodical. They had been sent specifically to capture her, to test if the stories were exaggerated. But as they stepped into the forest, she felt no fear, only anticipation. The jungle had taught her patience, and she had learned that the right moment, the perfect timing, could turn even the boldest hunter into prey. She watched them silently from the dense foliage, their boots pressing into damp earth, lanterns swinging and casting flickering shadows. Their weapons gleamed, but she knew they would never her. They were entering her domain on her terms. Every step was observed, every sound analyzed, every misstep catalogued. She let them advance, confident that her traps and diversions would unfold perfectly. The first encounter was subtle, a small disturbance in the underbrush, just enough to make a shadow flicker at the edge of their vision, sent one man spinning around, tightening his grip on his whip. A branch snapped as if by magic, the sound echoing oddly, disorienting the group. One man fell into a hidden pit, and another, attempting to rescue him, became entangled in a web of vines positioned like threads in a spider's trap. Panic spread, and the girl smiled silently from above, knowing the forest itself was doing her bidding. She moved like a phantom, slipping between branches and shadows, invisible yet fully aware of every movement below. Her training in the natural world had sharpened her senses to an extraordinary level. She could detect the slightest change in wind, faintest crack of a twig, the nearly imperceptible vibration of footsteps. She could sense fear, desperation, and misjudgment in the men before they even knew it themselves, and she knew those emotions would become as powerful a weapon as the traps and obstacles she had prepared. As they pressed deeper, the men realized the forest was not just a backdrop, it was an active force against them. Every path twisted unexpectedly, every landmark led nowhere, every sound seemed to come from a different direction. Their confidence collapsed, replaced by confusion and growing fear. The girl guided them subtly, using the forest at every turn. She rustled leaves at precise moments, small objects fell from branches, and the shifting shadows created illusions of motion that were not real. The men were no longer the hunters, they had become the hunted. Hours passed, and the group started to break apart under the pressure of their own fear. One man shouted aggressively, trying to take command, but his voice was swallowed by the thick forest. Another attempted to follow a stream, thinking it would lead them out, only to find themselves trapped in a dense thicket, branches lashing at their skin and mud pulling at their boots. Every effort to regain control only pushed them further into confusion. By nightfall, the girl had guided them along a twisting, bewildering path, exhausting their bodies and minds without ever confronting them directly. She had learned from previous encounters that fear could be magnified through patience and timing. She let small moments of hope appear, paths that seemed open and safe, only to fold them back into uncertainty. She used the natural sounds of the jungle, the distant growl of predators, the sudden flutter of wings, the rustling of leaves, to create a sense of constant presence, as if the forest itself was alive and aware. Her enemies began to feel as though they were being watched all the time, that the girl existed everywhere and nowhere at once. By midnight, the men were barely able to think clearly. Their lanterns flickered weakly, casting shadows that seemed to move with an eerie life of their own. They called out, demanding to know her location, accusing each other of cowardice, blaming the forest itself for their failures. But she stayed silent, invisible, calculating her next move. She understood the potency of psychological warfare, the terror bred by uncertainty, and the despair of being pursued by someone who seemed untouchable. Her tactics were never cruelty for its own sake. She had no wish to cause harm beyond what was needed to protect herself. Each trap, each misdirection, each manipulation was meant to ensure her survival, to preserve the advantage she had gained through observation and patience. She did not need to teach the oppressors a formal lesson. The jungle was hers, not theirs, and their ideas of power meant nothing inside her domain. The following days became exercises in careful study. She observed her enemies closely, learning their habits, noticing how they fell apart under pressure, how quickly they lost coordination, how easily sounds and shadows could mislead them. She began to invent new strategies, blending her natural camouflage with psychological tricks. She left subtle marks for herself, a bent leaf here, a scratch on a tree there, guiding her through the forest while sending false signals to anyone trying to follow. Each innovation made the jungle even more formidable, more mysterious, more impossible to conquer. Even the animals seemed to sense her authority. Birds would scatter when she approached, only to return and mislead intruders. Monkeys made sudden noises, drawing attention away from her hidden position. Predators, though dangerous, often hesitated, sensing an unusual presence. She had become part of the ecosystem in a way that transcended simple fear or understanding. The jungle responded to her intent as naturally as it responded to sunlight or flowing water. Her reputation spread beyond the plantation. Nearby settlements whispered about a girl who could vanish into the forest, appearing and disappearing at will, a person who seemed to control the land itself. White men avoided the jungle when her name arose, wary of the unknown, uncertain what awaited them. Some suggested she had supernatural powers, others claimed witchcraft. But the reality was simpler and far more impressive. She had mastered the environment, learned its secrets, and combined intelligence, patience, and careful observation to become untouchable. Within the plantation, her influence was quiet but profound. The slaves looked to her not as a leader but as a symbol of hope and endurance. Her actions showed that knowledge, courage, and strategy could outweigh brute strength, that oppressive systems could be challenged through skill and insight. She inspired others to watch, to learn, to respect the world around them. Her presence shifted the psychological landscape of the planter, subtly altering power and fear in ways the masters could not control. As the 5th week ended, she prepared for a final test of her abilities. The men had regrouped, determined to prove they could outsmart her. They moved with renewed confidence, carrying torches, weapons, and pride. But she had foreseen this. Every step they took, every tactic they tried, had already been anticipated. She set fresh diversions, adjusted old traps, and positioned herself high in the canopy, watching without being seen. When the confrontation came, it became a perfect execution of strategy. She controlled sound and movement, leading the men deeper into the jungle, into traps that confused and exhausted them. Shadows twisted, branches blocked their paths, animals caused distractions, and the forest itself seemed to move unpredictably. Every error they made was amplified. Every misstep fell right into the plan she had devised. By the time they admitted defeat, the group was shattered, demoralized, terrified. They returned to the plantation edge, some limping, some shaken, none daring to speak of what had happened except in hushed whispers. The master, seeing them return, could sense the shift in power. The girl had become untouchable, a force whose command reached beyond survival into legend. She did not celebrate. She continued her routines, fetching water, tending the garden, observing the world around her with quiet focus. Her connection to the jungle was total and unbroken. The forest had claimed her, and she had claimed it. Her skills, intelligence, and patience transformed the environment into an extension of herself, a living ally that ensured her safety and amplified her influence. News of her victories spread far and wide, reaching nearby plantations, inspiring awe, fear, and speculation. Men whispered her name cautiously. Women spoke it with reverence. The slaves recognized in her a power both extraordinary and deeply human. She had become a master not through violence, but through understanding, observation, and patience, the very qualities that had allowed her to survive, thrive, and make the jungle her own. By the end of this part of her story, the lesson was clear. Control over fear, over the environment, and over perception could elevate even the powerless into legend. She had transformed from a simple slave into a force of nature, a living embodiment of strategy, patience, and intelligence. The jungle was no longer merely a refuge, it had become her kingdom, and she ruled it with quiet, unyielding power. By the 6th week, the girl had fully integrated with the forest. Every tree, every vine, every shadow became a tool, a weapon, a guide. She no longer merely survived. She orchestrated, manipulated, and commanded her environment with astonishing precision. Her reputation had grown beyond the plantation. Stories traveled along quiet paths, reaching other estates, nearby settlements, and the occasional traveler brave enough to approach. Her legend had become a warning, a psychological weapon in itself. The change began with small shifts in the plantation men's behavior. Those who had previously entered the forest now refused to go near it. They spoke of phantom footsteps, impossible noises, and sudden vanishings. Every minor sound, a broken branch, a rustle, a fleeting shadow, was blamed on her. Their confidence diminished daily, replaced by fear and suspicion. Even the master, who had once dismissed her as a mere child, hesitated before sending anyone into the forest. The balance of power had shifted, and the girl understood it. She had learned that fear could be wielded as effectively as any weapon. She spent her mornings scouting deeper into the jungle, mapping hidden streams, natural shelters, and high perches from which she could see miles of territory. She tracked animal behavior carefully, noting which predators hunted at night, which bird calls signaled danger, and how small mammals moved through the underbrush. Each observation fed into her mental map, letting her predict the movements of anyone entering her domain. The forest now felt alive with her presence, amplifying her influence and guarding her constantly. One morning she noticed a larger group than ever approaching. 8 men armed with rifles and lanterns, brimming with disbelief in the stories they had heard. They came not as individuals, but as a coordinated hunting party, certain that sheer numbers, planning, and weapons could defeat her. But she knew otherwise. She had studied groups like this, anticipating the mistakes overconfidence, ego, and ignorance would create. She waited, hidden in the branches of a massive oak, watching their formation. The men moved confidently at first, their lanterns cutting long beams across paths she had already altered to mislead and trap them. They shouted to assert authority over each other and the forest, but the jungle responded in ways they could not comprehend. Branches snapped to suggest unseen foe. Lowers, leaves rustled in directions where no one stood, and their focus split, just as she had predicted. As they advanced, she deployed her network of traps and illusions, pitfalls hidden beneath leaves, tangles of vines set to trip and ensnare, and misleading signs that guided them deeper into confusion. Punctuation trails that looped back on themselves all came into effect. Each man responded differently to the obstacles. One panicked and yelled, another tried to take charge aggressively, while yet another froze completely, unsure of which way to move next. She watched every reaction closely, noting how fear twisted their thinking and disrupted their coordination. The forest itself became a force multiplier, turning their strengths and weapons into liabilities. By midday, the group was thoroughly worn out and lost. They could no longer read the natural signs they had once relied on, the direction of streams, the sun's position, even the calls of birds, all of which she had learned to manipulate. Her control over the environment extended to subtle auditory illusions, like leaves rustling at calculated moments, branches snapping deliberately to startle, and small animals moving to draw attention away from her hidden paths. Every part of the jungle worked in tandem with her, and she used it flawlessly without ever showing herself. The psychological effect on the men was enormous. They began to distrust one another, blaming each other for mistakes and weakness. Their confidence eroded quickly, replaced by growing paranoia. Shadows became threats. Every sound seemed like an ambush. The shifting wind hinted at unseen eyes. By the time they realized they could not navigate the terrain, it was already too late. Exhaustion, fear, and confusion had taken control, leaving them unable to act together or escape effectively. She had foreseen the possibility of violence and had prepared subtle defenses. Hidden branches, carefully arranged vines, and elevated perches allowed to maintain a safe distance while controlling the flow of the encounter. She knew that direct confrontation was unnecessary. The forest itself carried out her strategic intent. By letting the men make errors, wear themselves out, and fall into fear, she maintained complete control without ever risking herself. Hours passed and night fell, worsening the group's condition. Their lanterns flickered, panic spreading with each passing minute. One man tried to charge forward forcefully, only to become entangled in vines set precisely to trap him. Another stumbled into a camouflaged pit, scraping his leg and further shaking his resolve. The jungle, guided by her presence, seemed alive with purpose, and the men felt as if the forest itself conspired against them. The girl stayed silent, watching, calculating, letting fear work its subtle magic. By midnight, the group had broken apart entirely. Some tried to flee in different directions, each becoming lost in the network of paths and traps he had designed. Others froze, paralyzed by terror and exhaustion. The girl moved quietly between trees, checking her traps and adjusting small details to maximize their effect. Every action was deliberate, informed by close observation and experience. She had transformed the jungle into a tool of strategy, intelligence, and control, while her enemies remained powerless against it. The psychological impact reached beyond the immediate encounter. Word of the failed expedition spread rapidly, creating an atmosphere of fear not only among those who had entered the jungle but throughout the plantation. White men hesitated before approaching the forest, and even routine work was tinged with apprehension. Meanwhile, the enslaved people began to understand the power of observation, intelligence, and patience over brute force. They saw from her example that survival relied not just on endurance, but on knowing the environment and using it to their advantage. Her influence extended even further. She began experimenting with the jungle as a teaching tool, setting minor traps and challenges for herself while observing the reactions of animals and humans alike. She learned to use scent, shadow and sound to create illusions, mislead observers, and anticipate the movements of anyone who entered her territory. Every detail of the forest became part of her strategy, and she moved through it with the quiet confidence of someone who understood both nature and the human mind. By the 7th day of the 6th week, her techniques had reached near perfection. Her traps were subtle yet deadly effective, her manipulation of sound and shadow flawless, and her understanding of human psychology comprehensive. She could predict movements, anticipate reactions, and exploit fear without ever revealing herself. Her enemies were no longer threats, they were pieces on a chessboard, moved not by violence but by knowledge, patience, and strategic foresight. The legend of the girl grew steadily. Stories circulated not only of her ability to vanish into the jungle, but of her intelligence, cunning, and mastery of strategy. Some whispered of supernatural powers, while others claimed the forest itself was her ally. Yet the truth was simpler and far more extraordinary. She had become one with the jungle, a master of observation, strategy, and survival. The forest responded to her intent, amplified her influence, and ensured that no one could challenge her effectively. By the end of the 6th week, it was clear that she had gone beyond the role of mere fugitive or escaped slave. She had become a force of nature, a living embodiment of intelligence, strategy, and patience. The jungle was her realm, and she ruled it with subtle, unyielding power that no man could oppose. Fear had become her weapon, observation her shield, and the forest her ally. She was untouchable, invincible, and legendary, a symbol of resilience and mastery in a world that had sought to control and diminish her. By the 7th week, her reputation had reached the point where fear itself became a tool. Plantation men no longer approached the forest carelessly. They whispered, hesitated at every rustle, and doubted their own senses before stepping onto even familiar paths. She had learned that control over the mind could be as powerful, if not more so, than control over the physical environment. She had watched countless humans over the weeks, noting patterns of behavior, tendencies in fear, and the ease with which uncertainty could unravel even the strongest-willed men. Her days began early with quiet assessments of the forest. She moved barefoot over damp soil, listening to the soft sounds of life awakening around her. Birds sang their morning songs, insects hummed gently, and the distant roar of a river gave the jungle a steady pulse. She knew the duality of her surroundings, the beauty of nature intertwined with constant danger. She had learned to respect every creature, from the tiniest ant to prowling jaguar, understanding that each had a role and could either aid or obstruct her. This week she decided to test her psychological tactics on a larger scale. A group of 10 plantation men, the strongest and most experienced, volunteered to enter the jungle. They believed that numbers, strength, and coordination would finally allow them to capture or kill her. They did not realize they were entering a space already mastered by someone who knew its secrets intimately. She watched from above, hidden in the canopy, noting their rhythm, the way they divided attention, and subtle signs of arrogance in their posture. She let them advance into the first layer of her defenses, misleading trails designed to fragment and confuse. Each path seemed to lead forward, but in reality, all looped back toward the same clearing, creating a sense of déjà vu and disorientation. The men argued quietly at first, then more angrily, their confidence eroding as they failed to find familiar landmark. She watched from her perch, seeing how quickly minor frustrations escalated into mistakes. Then came the traps, each carefully designed to exploit both their physical and psychological weaknesses. A snare here, a hidden pit there, subtle disruptions creating the illusion of a deliberate, malevolent intelligence at work. One man fell into a shallow trap, only to be caught by a net of vines dangling from a low branch. Another was startled by a sequence of carefully placed sounds, crafted using stones, twigs, and the movements of animals. Panic spread quickly. The first signs of fear fractured their coordination completely. The girl remained unseen, knowing her absence could be as terrifying as her presence. Every rustle, shadow, and whispering noise reinforced the idea that she was everywhere and nowhere at once. The men began to hesitate, second-guess their choices, and increasingly rely on each other. Yet each man's fear amplified the others, creating a feedback loop of terror. Confidence, once a fortress, became a cage. By midday, the group was utterly exhausted. They had traveled miles, followed false paths, avoided traps, and yet felt as though the forest itself opposed them. One man tried to assert authority, shouting orders, but only heightened tension. Missteps, miscommunication, and fear compounded until the group broke into smaller, disoriented clusters. Each man became vulnerable, isolated by the jungle and his own failing courage. The girl used this moment to escalate her tactics. She deployed a series of auditory illusions. Snapping leaves mimicked movement, distant predator sounds echoed, sudden wing flaps above suggested hidden threats. Each sound was calculated to exploit the fears she had observed, and each reaction reinforced her understanding of human psychology. The men's senses, once relied upon for survival, became tools of manipulation. Punctuation had slowly become their biggest weakness. They could no longer rely on their sight, their hearing, or even their own sense of judgment. She let one man drift into total isolation, guiding him down a path that appeared safe and hopeful, only to end in a carefully hidden trap. He fell hard, clawing at the ground in panic, only to be caught in a web of vines that locked him in place long enough to destroy his confidence. By the time the others noticed his absence, he was already trapped and struggling, and their efforts to help only created more disorder and fear. Panic spread quickly through the group, passing from one man to the next, weakening their resolve and clouding their thinking. As the sun sank below the treetops and shadows swallowed the forest, the girl watched the remaining men from high above. They were scattered, worn down, and terrified. Their lanterns glowed weakly among the bushes, throwing twisted shadows that made it impossible to tell what was real and what was imagined. She had transformed the jungle into a living maze, a mental puzzle where even skilled hunters lost their sense of direction, confidence, and power. Night was her strongest ally. She used the darkness like a weapon, moving quietly above and around those who chased her. Sounds became her tools. A soft rustle here, a sharp crack of a branch there, the distant cry of an owl timed perfectly to unsettle them. Every sound was planned to confuse, mislead, and frighten. She controlled the forest not through force but through knowledge and patience. By the time men understood they could no longer find their way, fear and exhaustion had already defeated them. By midnight, they were broken. Their teamwork was gone, their spirits crushed, and their sense of reality twisted. Some tried to run, only to get lost deeper in the forest. Others stood frozen, unable to move, haunted by the feeling that unseen eyes followed them. The girl remained unseen, her presence felt only through the chaos she created. The forest became her tool, magnifying her intelligence and planning while keeping her safe. In the days that followed, stories about her continued to spread. Tales of her cleverness and control reached the plantation, where white men spoke her name with fear and reluctant respect. Her name became tied to the jungle itself. To enter the forest was to step into her world, and few dared to try. Even the master, who once saw her as nothing more than a child, now understood she could not be controlled in ordinary ways. She had gone beyond the limits forced upon her as a slave, using her mind, strategy, and understanding of people and nature to claim absolute authority. The other slaves watched her from afar with admiration. She proved that survival and strength did not depend only on physical power, but on intelligence, patience, and awareness. Her victories inspired hope, showing that even under brutal conditions, cleverness and planning could win. She became a living sign of resistance, proof that humans can adapt, learn, and endure against overwhelming odds. During this time, her daily routines were careful and disciplined. She spent long hours studying animal movements, testing new traps, and improving her methods of hiding and deception. She explored deeper parts of the forest, finding hidden water sources, natural shelters, and high lookout points that gave her control over wide areas. Her knowledge of the jungle became complete, almost total within her territory. Every plant, animal, and piece of land became a resource she could use to protect herself and maintain control. By the end of the 7th week, she had made the plantation men incapable of challenging her. Every attempt to capture or kill her failed, leaving them afraid and unsure. What once served as shelter had turned into a fortress, alive and responsive, strengthening her advantages while destroying theirs. She had become a master planner, a psychological strategist, and a symbol of fear and respect. She understood the power she now held. Her command of the land and her skill at shaping perception created a near-mythical image in the minds of those who hunted her. She was untouchable,